Hey everyone, welcome to Radium 2, Part 2. As you can see, I'm measuring up for the water cooling loops. There are some great questions that I'm often asked, and the answers to these questions pretty much hold all of the information that you need for loop design, for the best possible loop design. So the questions are, how do you plan out your loops? When do you plan them? And do you need to plan them at all? Meaning, are you experienced enough to just not really need to think about it? So I'll answer all of these questions in one. Well, when I plan the loop depends if the build is modified. Basically, the more heavily modified the build is, the earlier I will plan the loop. If it's really heavily modified, I'll plan the loop right at the beginning. Because unlike some other people, I consider the loop to be the number one priority. I mean, if you're going to be installing a water cooling loop into that system, then it's really right up there in priority with the core components. So it needs to be thought about right at the start with the layout. Do I need to think about it? Well, it depends again on the build. For this build, I didn't really need to think about it because what happens for me, I've done it so many times, it happens subconsciously. As I'm installing the components, I get a feel for the case and the components, and by the time they're installed, I already know exactly what I need to do. And how I figure out my loop design, basically what is happening subconsciously, for example, when I was building this system, there is only a couple, or usually one, component order that is going to give you the shortest possible tube lengths. And if you want to build a loop properly, if you want to build a beautiful loop that is clean, understated, looks like it's been built by somebody who really knows what they're doing, then this is the only thing you need to consider. Component order is number one. And you need to find that component order, just like it's a puzzle, that gives you that shortest possible tube. It is a lot easier than it sounds because all you need to do is start somewhere and go to the nearest component. So let's start at the pump. What's the nearest component? Then again, what's the nearest component to the next one? And so on. Obviously, if the component doesn't make sense, then you can't go to that component. So, you can't go from the reservoir to the radiator and then to the pump. I mean, usually you're using a pump and res combo and they're combined anyway. But yeah, you get what I mean. There are other things to consider as well, but that is number one. There are a lot of other people that don't, actually I don't know anyone that does this. Everyone else seems to use different logic when they're building loops, which leads to, component orders that give all sorts of tubing routings and, massive lengths. They zigzag backwards and forwards across the case. These are things that I really like to try to avoid because it leads to crossing tube and all sorts of other things that I don't like to do. So yeah, if you can find that component order that gives you the shortest routing, it's just this great feeling because everything else falls into place. You end up going around in a circle. That's kind of a general circle. You end up not crossing tube. Yeah, it really works out nicely a lot of the time. So that's how I plan my loops, and yeah, that usually falls into place subconsciously depending on the complexity of the system. So if there's a lot of customization, if there's a lot of components, then I'll definitely need to think it out. And sometimes, you'll have to sit there and really think it out a few times. Now you can see how many attempts I've had at installing this one length of tube into the build. And I just wanted to show this as an example of the challenges that you run into with a build like this, where we're jamming a whole lot of high-end components into quite a small case. And also a case that is not really properly designed for water cooling. And, we are also installing dual loops. So it's actually quite a challenge. This was quite a challenging little build. This is only one example of probably 20 occasions that I ran into a situation like this where the components need to be installed in a very specific way and also in a very specific order. So you can see that I've finally got this length of tube into position, The difficulty is that it's actually up behind the 360mm radiator at the top of the build. And the particular fittings configuration that I had to use to get that tube up there didn't allow me to just push the tube up across the top of the reservoirs. So I had to end up using the rotary section on one of the 90-degree fittings and tighten that up. And you can see how tight it is down here in the lower compartment under the power supply shroud, because at the front we have the fans and radiator. We then have the two pumps with the drainage systems, a hard drive, the power supply, all of the cables, which, most of which are not even installed yet. And we have the Aquaro at the front there, which is the Aquaro 6 Pro, which we had to obviously do a little mod to install. We cut a hole in the power supply shroud. Now, to do this, we had to install all of the components for test fitting, then remove all of them again, because you can't have anything installed when you're doing case mods, obviously, otherwise you're going to get iron filings, and you don't want these anywhere near any of the components, obviously. And we had a few positions in mind for the Aquaro, but this was the only place that it would actually fit. So you can really see how much of a tight fit it is now. I mean, installing these two drainage systems took me about an hour and a half because it was just so tight that I couldn't get my hands in. And you can see the combination of fittings that I've used for each one. There are some quite complex fittings configurations here. So on the back one, we have a T-fitting connected to the pump top with a male-to-male fitting, connected to the through panel fitting with another male-to-male fitting, connected with a mini D-plug to the mini valve. And then for this one at the front, we have a Q fitting coming out of the pump, a telescopic fitting going to a 90-degree single rotary fitting, and then up through the through panel fitting. And I couldn't just install these fittings in the conventional way. Again, I had to use the rotary sections and rotate them to tighten the fittings, and they all had to go in a perfect, very specific order for it all to work. For example, the Q fitting had to be added by completely undoing the telescopic fitting, pulling it out of the socket, and then pushing it in. Again, on this side, I've connected the mini valve with a mini D-plug, which is a config that I often do, but you can see how well this works. It's just, I'm really happy with the way it turned out. The layout here is perfect. All we need to do is install 90-degree fittings onto these, and then you can run the tube over the hard drive and out the side of the build. And now Johan is working on the final lengths of tube for the CPU, motherboard, and memory loop. And that's the other thing. We're not just installing extreme components, dual loops. We're also cooling the CPU, the memory, the motherboard, and the graphics cards. And it's not just the monoblock on the motherboard either. It's two separate water blocks, and then also the memory. So there's a lot going into this build, and the biggest challenge with a build like this is to install the components in such a way so it comes down to the layout, it comes down to the tubing routing, the way the cables are done, where the build doesn't end up looking cluttered. I mean, obviously you can see there's a lot in here, but in the end you'll really see what I mean when the build is complete, but it's not going to look cluttered. And actually, one of the really important aspects of that is the dual tube reservoirs, which is only possible with an Ethereal dual reservoir mount. Due to the limited space in this build, I've decided to separate the building and filling of the two loops. This is to make things a little bit easier, but it's mostly to minimize risk. Obviously, you should do everything that you can to minimize the risk of damage from leaks. So there's all of the obvious things, and I've talked about this, the precautions you can take many times, but out of the different precautions, the paper towels, externally powering your pumps, and the drainage system and anything else that you can do, such as, not installing the custom cables until last, basically leaving the installation of as many components as possible until after the filling of the loops. My favorite precaution is definitely the drainage system. If I could have one, I would just have the drainage system because it's the quickest way to stop a leak. So I filled the loop and you could see how quick and easy that was because, there is a lot of components in this loop. There's 6. But a lot of this loop, the volume is down below. So that all filled up quite quickly, and with a flick of the switch, it was already going. Sometimes, if a lot of the volume of the loop is above the res, you'll have to fill the res 3 or 4 times before you'll get full circulation. So the coolant is Mayhem's X1 Clear, and I like to use X1 Clear or just straight pastel white so that I can dye the coolant myself. This is because I want my builds to be as unique as possible, and if I can add unique coolant colors to that as well, then obviously I'm going to. It makes the build even more unique, and I love dyeing coolant. It is a lot of fun. I have the full collection of Mayhem's dyes, and there are so many different colors, and they're so vibrant and beautiful, you can just do anything with them. In this build, I wanted a really bright cherry red, and I'm really happy with the way it's turned out. I actually used a little touch of pink in this as well to get it even brighter. So, you can use red, UV red, pink, UV pink, deep red, even a little bit of blue to get a blood red, and that's just red. There's so much you can do. We've installed the graphics cards, and also we've added backplates now, which are nickel plated, and backplates are just a must in a water-cooled build. It changes the build so much. It ends up looking so much more elegant, and I love the nickel plated backplates from EK. We've built the graphics card loop, and what are we doing? We're now draining it. We've only just filled it, and we are immediately draining it. I've gone from praising Mayhem's to now having something a little bit bad to say, but not really, because I do praise their variety of colors. So they have a pastel black, which is not quite black, and they have an X1 black. And the X1 black, I think it's called oil black, is just a pure, beautiful jet black. It is so black. And, so it shows up a lot more on camera, by the way. This looks like a purple or blue, but in real life, it's hardly noticeable. But when I saw this on camera, I was like, okay, we've got to change to the X1. So we're now in the process of flushing the loop, and I will continue flushing it out until it's completely transparent. I've measured exactly the amount of distilled water that I've added so that I know how much to concentrate the coolant that I put in. Because obviously some of that distilled water is going to remain in the loop even after it's been drained again. That sums up this video. Thanks for watching, and remember that none of this would be possible without our patrons.